If I had, at the point in my career where I wanted to write The Not So Big House, started off with the premise, how am I going to make everybody build smaller houses? I would not have written that book, and I would have been taking something that was impossible to solve, and I'd probably have gotten overwhelmed from trying to solve it. Solutions to problems come from working where you are in your environment and responding to what comes your way. It isn't grandiose. It's very small. If you look at what I've done, they were little tiny things in little tiny places where people heard what was going on and said, oh my goodness, that's what we need. And that's what makes something shift. It's like when you put a precipitate into a liquid and suddenly you've got a new material. It's that kind of change.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neil Collins, and on the show today we have internationally acclaimed architect Sarah Susanka. And for the first time, I'm joined by a co-host, former podcast guest Ross Chapin, to talk about creating a global movement that celebrates life and holism through design. I'll be the first to admit that I am a novice when it comes to design. I find myself in a journey discovering what design really is, how it is both innate to life and the universe, as well as how it is conceived of by the human mind. I read a quote once that I wish I could attribute to a source that says that the world we design for is the world that we get. Those words have come to ring more and more true the deeper I get into the philosophy that underpins regenerative real estate. This is because I've had to go through an unlearning process to realize that design isn't just about creating beautiful homes and buildings, but it extends to all facets of our lives and how we interact with ourselves and the world around us. The resonance of good design isn't a pretty picture that goes onto the front of a magazine. No, it goes beyond beauty. It exudes respect and it celebrates humanity. Good design is timeless as it is in service to life and brings aliveness that cultivates and enriches community. There's a pattern to this kind of design, and one that has been eloquently expressed through the writings of Christopher Alexander in his seminal book called A Pattern Language. For the first time to the show, we have Sarah Susanka, who is a multiple times over best-selling author and internationally renowned architect, credited with the start of the tiny house movement. She wrote the book The Not So Big House at a time in the 90s when the architectural world was pumping out McMansions in the suburbs. She's gone on to write many more books that have changed the culture and helped to showcase how design can create the conditions for both livability and environmental responsibility. We're also in for a real treat because I'm joined for the first time by a co-host who is a former guest on this show. Ross Chapin is another architectural icon who is the originator of the Pocket neighborhood, who began building smaller, right-sized homes that instead of facing outwards to activate the car and the concrete, faced inwards to promote connection, community, and security. This conversation was an incredible experience for me personally because I got to learn how both Sarah and Ross integrated Christopher Alexander's pattern language to form the bedrock of their designs, their principles, which both used to create massively successful homes, neighborhoods, and careers. Not only did I find this conversation both insightful and nourishing, but also highly encouraging, since this is a time when more than ever we need guides and frameworks to illuminate a path that is in service towards life, rather than towards an economic system that is run amok. This is such a pleasure getting to have you, Sarah, on the podcast. Ross is a returning person to the podcast. He was an early interviewee. And I met Ross because I was really trying to figure out where sustainability was within the real estate industry. And the more and more I dug into the industry, the more I realized that the dominant conversation is around areas of energy efficiency and solar and electrification and all amazing things. Don't get me wrong. But it seemed to be missing some of the other elements of ecology and health and wellness and the spirit of home. And then what really did it for me is understanding community and relationships and how that we design for this. And so it didn't take long to stumble upon some of Ross's neighborhoods that he was a part of.
Right.
And it was a completely transformational experience to go through that.
And were you in Langley at that time?
No, I was in Portland. And the first pocket neighborhood that I had visited was in White Salmon, Washington. Mm-hmm. And it was like, what's going on here? This is really interesting.
Cool. Yeah.
And then in Portland's an amazing city because there's a lot of opportunities to go see pocket neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And so we actually invited Ross to a dinner that I knew he was going to be speaking at a conference about pocket neighborhoods.
I want to interrupt. This is not just a dinner. This is probably about 25 of his collegial friends in the building and development and green building world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool.
And we struck up a relationship. And I think the big opportunity for us was this past August, when the worst time to move in my life, pretty much, Ross said, we've got this little house that I designed. It's around the corner from us on Whidbey Island, and you've been coming up here, and do you want to try it on? And there's a Waldorf school. And what's so fun is that whenever we visited Whidbey Island the first time, we went walking with a 6-year-old that was leading us down this very small path in the woods. And it bordered onto this property called the Whidbey Institute. And I didn't know anything about it. And then we opened up from narrow trail onto this like great cathedral of an opening onto this school building. And you can automatically tell that it was a school building, and it's got this great steeple on it. And it felt so organic and just resonant with our philosophy of how we want to raise a child. Mm-hmm. And Ross connected with us at the end of the day, and he said, well, where did you guys go? And we said, we found this school in the woods, and it was incredible. Have you heard of it? I was like, I designed it.
I bet. I could tell from the features you were describing certain footprints.
And not just that, but the 100 acres surrounding that. And it's just been one of those incredible experiences to really start to try to shift the narrative from we're talking about sustainability to we're talking about regeneration. And that is a more holistic approach.
Absolutely. So you're living it.
We are living it, and we are learning every day, and we are learning what a not so big house feels like, and one that was designed and built with love, which is a new experience. And
so different. It's so interesting to have written books about not so big houses, obviously, and the logic of build better rather than bigger. But there's something alchemical that's beyond just size, especially when each of those houses has been made with care. And, from the ground up is formed from a vision of an architect and homeowner sort of imagining a world. And even though you're not the people that house was made for specifically, you can feel it. It's in the bones of the house, and it will be there forever. As long as that house exists, the people who are there feel it. It's just absolute magic.
We had the opportunity to work in India for a year, and there was someone that was always talking about how this food was made with love, and make sure you do not eat any food that was prepared with ill intention or just unintentionality of the act of preparing food. And so having that concept of prashad and then seeing how that can become grounded within our physical environment is just a whole new experience for me, where I feel like I'm at the very beginning of a very long philosophical lineage that both of you are in.
That's so wonderful. I mean, it's, Ross and I have had lives that have intersected on maybe 5 or 6 very noticeable moments where when we converse and there are others there, there's more. And it's always the case. It's just, there's something electric, and we're parts of 2 apparently separate movements that absolutely are one thing.
And it looks like you're both drinking from a similar cup, at least from Christopher Alexander's work. And this is a good point. I think that we can actually formally begin a conversation, which is you both spent time in Minnesota. You actually went to the University of Oregon, but let's pick it up with which is where you came from, Sarah. Was I know that you're not originally a U.S. citizen.
That's right. I grew up in England and then moved to Los Angeles, middle of suburbia. Interestingly, I'm in the process of selling the house that I moved to in 1971, right this moment. So my intersection with real estate agents right now is selling that very house. But I was astonished. I came from essentially an English pocket neighborhood. I mean, that's where I lived. So I grew up knowing everybody. We walked to the store every day to get groceries. We had a very teeny tiny refrigerator. I don't even know if we used it, frankly. It was very social in the community. And I moved from there to a suburb where I couldn't tell if there were people in the neighborhood. There were cars, but I walked to school every day, which is about 1.5 miles, which I gathered was really not what people did, because I was the only one doing it. And as I walked back each day to my house, I was 14 years old, and I thought, there has got to be something better than this, because it was like all the life that I knew wasn't there. It was like walking through some Avengers episode where nobody's there. I remember, it's like a world that's all plastic waiting for people. And I felt desolate. I knew in that moment, I'm going to do something about this. I just knew it. And I was only 14, but I just knew there was a better way than this. So that really colored my interest in architecture. And then I actually was at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo for, I think, 2 years. And I was there shortly after Chris Alexander had been there. And so he'd been to give a lecture. And one of my professors was very interested in Alexander. And so I told him, I want to go where Christopher Alexander is. And he says, well, right now he's at the University of Oregon. So then I went to the University of Oregon, just missing him. He'd just gone back to Berkeley. But anyway, University of Oregon was much more my cup of tea as a university school of architecture. And I made what I call a pilgrimage to Berkeley to meet Christopher Alexander, which I did. And he gave me a tour of the little house in the back that was designed with all of his design principles. And we had a wonderful conversation. I've never met him since then. And I know he passed away very, very recently, which is very sad for all of us who are really his children. I think of myself that way. I grew up just knowing that this was a very powerful way of thinking. He wrote a book, for those of your listeners that don't know, called A Pattern Language, which really looks at the basic principles that underlie all good building. And they're not really things that you're taught. They're things that if you've grown up in a village like I grew up, or your child will know from growing up in Langley, Washington. It's like we have this capacity to understand building when we grow up in vibrant community. But most people don't know that because they didn't. And so it's like we're re-educating a whole culture and generations of of humans to experience what's actually possible and to learn that they have built into their genetic structure the capacity to know what is a good building and what is a good community. And so that was my background.
What do you think it was when you saw the pattern language at first blush? What called you to it? And I'd love to, after that, Ross, have you chime in, because I've actually heard the story. And I think this is a really interesting opportunity that not a lot of people would be able to hear.
Yeah. When I started I actually, first of all, read pattern language in its rough form. So, they were just copies of pages. It hadn't fully been published yet. I think it was, I lived in a co-op in San Luis Obispo that was a bunch of architecture students, and two of them had worked with Alexander on putting that pattern language together. So they were really seminal in the creation of the book. So that's where I got these pages from, because they had some of them. And I knew before a pattern language even came out that it was an incredibly important book. I could feel the paradigm shift. And I was working with one of these architecture students. He was now graduated. And we started in San Luis Obispo to try to envision a community shopping center, essentially, a community shopping place. If you go to San Luis Obispo now, you can sort of see the legacy of that thinking. It never got rendered the way that we imagined, but we put together essentially a pattern book of patterns for San Luis Obispo to just make some there. And so, I was right in the middle of it, just seeing, wow, this is such a powerful way to think about structure and structuring and making community and making someplace that's alive.
What about you, Russ? That this was a fun story, because you had a similar experience, I believe.
I'm smiling. I've never heard Sarah's story.
Yeah, I've never described it before. I don't think.
Well, Sarah, I've heard, yes, you have embraced Chris Alexander, your works. If you really, you don't have to go very deep. You study your books. You're essentially making a pattern language available to far more people, because it is, it's so understandable, and you do it in a way with language that is our language of just regular folks in conversation. It's just not academic language. Not that Chris is, but the book can be a bit much to engage, in all of his books since then. And you are one, especially, who have embraced Chris's work and tried to bring it down to the essence and offer it out in ways that it can be integrated into people's lives.
Right. And where they recognize that this is about their life. When I started my firm in Minnesota with my partner, Dale Malfinger, we wanted to use a pattern language in all of our projects. And we had a new client, and we told him about the book, A Pattern Language. We handed it to him. And for those that haven't seen it, it's quite a tome. And the client went away for 6 months while they read the book. We were a new company, and we realized this isn't going to work. We've got to find a way to sort of unpack this book so that people can understand what it offers in a short version. And so that's actually where I started doing presentations, public presentations. I did them at home and garden shows, and just trying to bring this language into the public realm using pictures that they recognize as home. So it was an important piece, I think, for all of us architects who were influenced by Alexander's work, the need to make something that bridged the divide of people who were going to spend the time to read it and people who really needed this but weren't going to read the book of that depth.
Yeah. Let me chime in here that I'm just smiling with this, because I also went to Berkeley on a pilgrimage to find Alexander. I was in Minnesota, and I grew up in a coherent neighborhood. 3 years into school, I went, this is not going where I need to go. And I stopped, went off to Europe, lived there for 18 months, came back thinking, where do I go to help create places that have the life and vibrancy of the villages that I was in Europe, okay, in the countryside primarily.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was going, well, maybe I finished my architectural education out in California because I have relatives out there, and I was intrigued with California. So I went out there, and my credits from the University of Minnesota, they didn't really acknowledge, and I'd have to take more years of school. And I said, I'm just about done with school. I'm not going to go to UC Berkeley, but I had no idea of Chris Alexander. For me, I love making places and spaces. For me, design is play. It's something that I just do until it feels right. It's until it comes alive, comes to a magical zing space. And I approach it intuitively in many ways. And when I was in the library at the architecture school, the librarian said, you might be interested in reading some of the manuscripts that are coming together in this room. And so they brought me to a back room at the library where all of the materials for the pattern language were being assembled and researched. And there were files and files and files of the various different patterns and the background work. And it had not been published. And there were papers. And I sat down at the table and started opening up the materials from the folders and got it immediately. I had this just energy, this something. It's just like, I was shaking because I went, this is seminal.
Yeah, that was the same feeling I had.
There's something here that is shifting the ground of our culture.
Right.
And I didn't have language for that. I was 20 years old, perhaps, something like that. But what I did was to copy as much as I could, stuff it in my pack, go back to Minnesota and finish out school there. And I had every project that I would do, I did with a filter, the lens, the framework of a pattern language. And the pattern language is web-like in the sense of a language.
That's right.
Language has a few elements, and they come together in these ways where poetry can be expressed, or a treatise on anything. The physical environments are shaped, especially the ones that are alive, are shaped in very much the way languages are shaped and have relationships. There are implied meanings, there are effects. It relates in terms of larger concepts as well as small details. And so that whole notion was so exciting. And I followed up with that by going and doing construction hands-on. How do I actually work with a pattern language with real buildings? How do we shape this? Yeah. I did meet Chris a couple of years later. I'd finished my architecture degree. I was actually back in San Francisco doing improvisational dance. That's a whole other story. You can listen to our first podcast on that. Okay. And I ventured across the bay and met Chris, and he was very kind. I was at his home, and we had tea together. And I went on, and the foundations, the theoretical foundations of that work have been with me ever since. Yeah. And I need to say that here, this is where I think we come in, and maybe Chris too. Mm-hmm. The foundations of Chris's work are trying to discover the source of life, the source of wholeness. Where do we find wholeness? And what does it elicit within us when we are in whole places? And it's very personal. And I think the personal lives, how do we find a life that has a center, a life that is whole, a life where we are fed, a life where we can find our gift, whatever it is, and offer it to the world. And so you went on to explore a not so big life, which is in many ways going deeper into
using the same
more of the source conditions.
That's right.
And I was doing that, on my own as I'm trying to make my way. Mm-hmm. If I was not early along, if I was not doing the work I loved, I would have a hard time getting up in the morning. Yeah. And when I was in my early 20s, I just said, I'm not doing that anymore.
That's exactly, we have very parallel. It's interesting we're having this conversation because we haven't had the opportunity to share these sort of details, but I was in a regular architecture firm doing commercial architecture. I was doing energy efficient design, but I could not get into worrying about how many square feet this office had compared to that one. It had nothing to do with square footage. It had to do with the quality of the space and this myopic view of everybody's got to have the same amount of space was life killing. It was like, what are we doing? What is the point of this? So that's why I started my own firm.
Sarah, in an early firm that I worked in, they were doing shopping malls.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was helping design shopping malls,
Right.
basically being the drafter. Yeah. And as I got into it, I was realizing that they were using patterns, but they were using patterns in almost an anti-pattern way. They were helping get people into a space where they would be consumers, where they would want to buy, where they'd reach in, they'd just be dazzled by all of the colors and the lights and the newness and the novelty. And they would say, I want this. So and they would bring out their pocketbook and they would want to buy. And we designed for that.
Right. This is manipulation.
I said enough. It's manipulation. This is how
literally buildings and structures can manipulate you into particular responses. Now, architects of every stripe use the capacity. Like I have one principle that I call light to walk towards with a punchline. It's not just a near-death experience. We are programmed as human beings to move towards light. This is one of the not so big design principles, but it's built right into us. So you could call that manipulation. But if you understand that we're inspired when we move towards a window or a lighted painting at the end of the hallway, our whole body responds. We're programmed that way. So that is a life affirming. What you're just describing, Ross, is, you can also manipulate people to just go and do what you want them to do, which in this case is spend money. As an architect, if you're sensitive, you are aware this capacity that I have is being used inappropriately. And I think both of us must have had that experience as young people. Probably quite idealistic young people. We knew there was a better thing that we could be doing with our time and energy.
As you're describing this, I'm realizing that we are, and perhaps the people listening to this, maybe they are involved in the real estate world, maybe they're involved professionally in other ways. Who and what is it that we serve?
Yeah.
If we are using patterns and pattern languages, if we're working with space, we can sell houses on curb appeal, but does it match their lives?
That's right.
We can design spaces, but is it serving the consumer god or is it serving life itself? Right. And I feel that the three of us, certainly, and Neil, the field of people that you are attracting to your world, your network, your web, and this conversation, I feel are somehow or another, they're serving life itself. And we have different ways of serving life. And Sarah, I think your Not So Big Life is helping people discover, helping create the space, create the potential of discovering what matters.
Yeah, within their own lives. It's so we're making a leap here, and I just sort of, so that we can take your audience. Yeah. So I spent 20 some years speaking about not so big house design, helping people to understand how do you give a house this feeling of aliveness that Ross is talking about. And one of the things that I was very interested in doing, which a pattern language carries right at its heart, is that if you help people to connect to their own inner awareness of beauty, of feeling at home, at ease, then they can start to find places that look and feel like that. But if you've never connected the dots and let people know you have this innately, you just have to learn how to speak this language. But it's already here. You're just learning how to use it. That's what Home by Design is all about. This is one of the books in my series that actually doesn't have not so big in the title, but it's really the core. It's all the key principles are there. So looking at what is it that makes you go when you look at a house, or you even just look at it from the outside, this is it. What makes you know that, even though you don't actually know how many bedrooms it's got? It's like, this feels like home. And then half the things on the list may go by the wayside because it's got that certain something that makes you feel alive. So that's what that book is really helping people to understand. But after I'd written the Not So Big House series, and there's actually, I think at this point, 9 books in the series, there's something that I wanted to be able to speak about life, what Ross is referring to here. I couldn't have even started writing the Not So Big House series if I hadn't started to pay attention to what matters in my own life, and how do I start living with more integrity, essentially, where there aren't these big divisions of that's work, this is home, that I'm starting to live one life. And so as I began to try to put these ideas into words, what I realized was that there was a way to describe life design as though you were doing a remodeling to your life, just as I'd written Not So Big Remodeling, looking at how do I remodel my house so that it fits me without adding a huge addition, using the space that's there. We already have the space in our lives to rethink how we're actually inhabiting this time and space that we have here. So the Not So Big Life is really, it's a parallel. It takes the same kind of thinking as a pattern language, but it brings it into a toolbox, essentially, of ways to look at how am I living my life, and does it have the kind of integrity inside and out that makes me feel at home? And most people don't even know how to begin that thinking process. But that's what I'm about, is whether I'm talking about buildings or life, it's the same set of issues. It's just rendered, one's about space, one's about time, but they're both really dimensions of occupying our lives in an alive way.
Before we get back into the episode, I want to share something incredibly exciting with you. For the first time ever, there's going to be a regenerative real estate gathering at the end of the summer at the one and only Riverbend Farm in Saco, Maine. Now, I'd call it a conference, but that would definitely be doing it injustice, as the gathering at the world-famous Riverbend Farm will be like no other conference you have attended. This place may sound familiar to you if you tuned into the episode I did with Drew Dumpsch in June of 2021. You see, Drew is the founder and the executive director of the Ecology School, which is housed at the bucolic 105-acre working Riverbend Farm. Not only will we enjoy the company of incredible visionaries and professionals, but the environment itself will blow you away. You see, the farm was designed as one of the world's first Living Community Challenge projects that is put out by the International Living Future Institute. This rigorous building certification goes beyond the Living Building Challenge and is the perfect setting to not just talk about how we can transform the real estate industry, but what it looks like, tastes like, and feels like in real life. So join us August 24th through the 27th and get to know the people behind this regenerative movement. These are the professionals that are part of the transformation of the way we inhabit this planet. They are designers and developers, consultants and lenders, and the ones that are shaping the future of how we design, build, transact, and steward land and place. During this time, you'll learn firsthand about the world's most innovative real estate projects, such as living buildings and living communities. You'll be able to swap strategies and get insights about funding sources that are looking to spur regenerative real estate projects. You'll be able to connect with regenerative practitioners that are revolutionizing the real estate industry by demonstrating that real estate can be used as a force for good. This is the time that we need leaders and co-creators like yourself, now more than ever. This is not an event that you're going to want to miss, and it'll be such a small investment that has truly a lifetime of value. You can learn more by visiting Latitude's journal at chooselatitude.com/journal to search for the event. I hope to see you there. I'm curious, you've really focused your writings around the metaphor of home, that parallel of home and life, and how to be very intentional with that. And Ross, I think you created a shift from working on these beautiful kind of single family custom designs into smaller community oriented clusters. What are the ways in which do these patterns scale? And this is a question for both of you, in terms of right-sized communities and right-sized homes, and how that really fits together, especially as we're living in a very complex world. And we have these mega cities, and you're talking about Los Angeles. Even whenever Los Angeles is getting built, it reminds me of that book Holy Land. We're building these huge monocultures of houses, and so how do we take this and bring it down into a single dwelling that is resonant of ourselves? But how do we also scale this up into communities so that this is not just accessed by one person or one family?
That's right. It's, I think just generically, I think what both Ross and I have spoken about in different ways is that there is a scale at which people can connect. And even if it's a gigantic city, if there's still these smaller relationships, that's where you live. So, I grew up in England, and if you actually look at the population of England, it's very dense. But you don't feel that when you're living there. It's because each pod, which is in this case a small village, has some green space around it. The density of where people live is high, but the quality of the connection between people and the community aspects make it very different than if it's all spread out like, butter across a slice of toast, exactly the same everywhere. It doesn't work. That's not community. So that's, I think, what we miss. And I think, honestly, just to hop to not so big living for a second, I have a feeling that part of the challenge of today's life that's resulted from COVID is that we have sort of lost the way that we had our previous pods of friends. And now we're making Zoom pods of friends, but there's still a need to have this collection of strong connections. Used to be, for a lot of people, that was family, and then that kind of got cut off because of COVID. So we've got this interesting place to observe what human beings really need in order to thrive. And I think that's when you're experiencing it directly, but when I go to visit one of Ross's pocket neighborhoods, thriving is happening. You can feel it the second you step over the threshold of the community.
When did you first stumble upon a pocket neighborhood, Sarah? When did you read about one? Or
I read about it first. So this was the story I was telling before we started recording, that I was creating the Not So Big House, which is my second book. And I wanted so badly to feature a pocket neighborhood in my book, but I was brand new to being a star. I didn't know I was a star yet. So Ross seemed like this sort of demigod that, I couldn't call him. Surely I couldn't call him. And my business partner, Dale Mulfinger, said, just call him. He's not a scary guy. I think he'd probably met you before, Ross. I'm not even sure. But so anyway, I mustered up my courage and called him, and we had this wonderful conversation. And sure enough, that book features houses from a couple of the neighborhoods that he had started designing. So that's where it really started. But I could tell, I knew the moment I saw Pocket Neighborhood, this is what my LA suburban experience was absolutely absent. And that's what I knew I really wanted to help promote.
What's so wild for me, and I want to underscore this for the listener, is that Sarah, you've been credited as initiating the tiny house movement.
I know. which I have to say, for years, I tried to say, I didn't, it's not me. And then gradually people in the tiny house movement said, you're not understanding. What they're saying is you inspired us to allow ourselves to think that small is okay. And that's so I wasn't the initiator, but if it's inspired people, wonderful. That's wonderful.
And Russ, you've been credited as the father of the pocket neighborhood, another concept that has really taken off and flourished. And you can find pocket neighborhoods across the country and the world that will trace back to some of the original neighborhoods that you put out. And I'm curious, this is another, just whoever wants to grab this one. In the 90s, when I would imagine you both are really starting to gain the fluency around the patterns, and you're building your careers. How lonely was it in the architectural world? And because it's now looking back, it's like, wow, look at where these philosophies have gone. Right. But in the 90s, oh my goodness, I would imagine that there probably wasn't too many people beating down your doors, but I could be wrong about that.
I wouldn't quite put it that way. I think that a lot of the notions of environmentalism, ecology, green building were happening. In the early 1970s, when I first got to the university, we designed and built a completely off-the-grid sustainable home in Minnesota, of all places. And we're introduced to E.F. Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful, and the idea of Buddhist economics and the principles of enoughness. A lot of these were around, and it was actually quite hopeful and encouraging. And we realized we were thinking we could change the world just like that. We just build a few of these things, and it's like everybody changes and it comes along. In fact, it hasn't quite gone that way. And I think the seeds of a viable, thriving, resilient future are here. They are alive now. We need to grow. And I think the community that you're bringing together helps us bring that into fullness. And whether it shifts the patterns of our culture, I am acting every day, thinking every day, being every day toward that. So that to me is key.
You know, I would add one thing about your question, Neil, which is that when you have a really burning passion for something, you tend to attract people around you who are of like mind. And I was unaware of how rare our community of architects in Minnesota was until I gave an AIA talk. I can't remember, it was Kansas City or somewhere like that. And we had started to really change the way that architectural services were offered. Our firm started to encourage other firms, for example, to go and speak and have booths at the Home and Garden Show. This is a very people-oriented, people need what we do. We just have to help them understand that this is what we do. So we had started essentially a movement within Minneapolis and St. Paul without knowing it. So when we went somewhere else, I was speaking to a large group of architects, and I said, given that the reception for architectural services is so much more positive today, and I was about to keep going with my sentence, and a guy stood up in the middle of the audience and he says, "Lady, what planet do you live on?" And I was just like, does anybody not have this experience? The whole audience said, it's not what we're experiencing. And that's when I realized we had changed our world by sharing what we had learned about how to run a firm, to offer services to residential clients. That was not normal. People moonlighted projects. So from the outside, looking at that period, yes, it was lonely, but we didn't experience the loneliness because we had built a world around us that was of like mind and changing the world essentially one city at a time. So if I look at the model of my life, that passion, which started me just going to a home and garden show and talking to a bunch of homeowners about how to use this thing, they didn't even know it was called a pattern language, to find some language to be able to speak about what they wanted. That then bred a desire in me to tell as many people as possible, as simply as possible. And what I didn't even realize I was doing at the time was then in writing a book about it, it gave other architects the ability to say, oh, I can do this. And then homeowners to say, I want an architect who does this. And suddenly it went countrywide. It was really astonishing and not something that I was aware of until it happened.
What you've done, Sarah, is that you have followed your passions. You've done what you felt was needed right in front of you. You've taken action. You've not sat back and kind of waited for somebody to tell you what to do. You've actually stepped forward in a very human, very engaging way. And what you've done in putting it out there is you've put a needle in an acupuncture point of culture that's ready to be electrified.
Good way to put it. Right.
Ready to be electrified. And when you press that needle in, it's like different parts of the network within the body light up. So my experience of creating the Third Street cottages, and if the listeners are there and you want to look at rosschapin.com and then look up Third Street Cottages, and the story is there. And buy Sarah's book. It's a great story in there. You wrote the best story. But when we did this, I was looking at the town that we live in, small town on the outskirts of Seattle. At that point in the early 90s, we were being inundated with people coming from California, retiring. It was a destination community for retirement, essentially. But also, there was this company in town that was getting started, Microsoft. And all of a sudden, there were millionaires showing up who hadn't been millionaires before. And they want to create these wow houses, these vanity homes. And they were coming. And the little town that I'm in, the zoning is your typical zoning of anywhere America.
Right.
Your standard lots fronted with garages. And this is the LA model that you were describing, but it's not just LA, it's everywhere in America. Well, that's what our little town had. And I was realizing that in our town, if you wanted to build a small house, if you wanted to build something where the automobile was subservient to people and pedestrian, you'd be hard put to do that.
That's right.
And so what I worked on with the city planner here is how to create incentives to build smaller in a community setting where the cars are secondary. And so we wrote a code. But it became the first code in the country, essentially a cottage courtyard code. And I had no idea of its history. No idea. I found that out when I wrote my book, that this is not a new idea. This is an old idea. In fact, it's older than America by far. But
this is that innate knowledge about what makes a vibrant community.
It's innate.
And it keeps the cycle comes around again because it wasn't absorbed the first time.
So what happened was that the code was in place. I was giving a talk at an eco-building conference on how to build smarter, smaller, better houses or something like that. Because I had been working on that for years. A lot of the things that you write about in your book that I was working with and building. Right. And so this fellow came up afterwards and said, I am so inspired by this. And can I come up because I understand that your town has this new code. I said, how would he know that? He loves reading code. He's a former planner. And he came up, and by the end of our first meeting here in Langley, we became partners. He is a developer, and I joined in with him. What do I know about development? Well, I've built, but I don't know anything about development. And so we borrowed more zeros than I'd ever seen before. And we built the Third Street Cottages with no comps. Get this, realtors, no comps. We knew the president of the local bank, and he really understood what I was up to, and also what Jim was up to. And they loaned us the money with lots of help from family and friends. We built these with no pre-sales because we were doing something that hadn't been done before. And we were thinking, oh, we don't want the buyer to say, oh, I need a 2-car garage. Oh, I need this or I need that. I said, I'm going to follow my
I had to show the model so that people could understand what it was. That's why I built my own not so big house.
Show the model.
You got to be able to illustrate.
So we built it, and then we put it up for sale. I'm sorry, no realtors. We were out there listening and talking with people. It sold within 2 months, and the realtors and everybody else said, what is this?
Yeah.
What happened, which I didn't realize, which is kind of like what your book was doing. We met a need that was in our little community for small homes in a community setting. What I didn't realize is that the plug that we tapped into was nationwide. And within 2 or 3 months, we were in 200 newspapers around the country. We were in Metropolitan Home, Metropolis. Sunset Magazine, which is all over the West, said this is the best new neighborhood of the West. Washington Post, New York Times. It was just like unbelievable. Yeah.
Right.
This need, and it's not just West Coast.
This is really an important point you're making, because what happens, and I'm talking to your audience right now, Neil, in a way so that, here we're at this point, the old guard. When we were doing this, we were the new guard. But in both cases, we were just serving a need that we saw because of our own work and our own lives. And that's how sustainable and resilient solutions arise. It doesn't come from doing something that somebody else has thought of better. It comes from inspiration, and you're in the trenches and you're going, why do we do it this way? Why do we have this zoning ordinance that makes it impossible for us to live the way that we naturally want to? To use Ross's illustration or mine, why do we keep building formal living rooms and formal dining rooms when every single client that comes to my office says, I only need those for resale? There's a basic misunderstanding that we have built into the infrastructure. So pioneers go in and say, we're not living this way anymore. We need to do something different. Or there's a segment of the population that's not being served, and we think this makes sense. And you're going to have to push some envelopes. It's not all easy. Even building my first not so big house, the banker told me, I can't lend you money on this because there's no formal living room and formal dining room. So I leaned forward and I said, can I ask you a question? And he said, of course. And I said, how many times have you used your formal living room and formal dining room? And he sat way back in his chair and he says, I've never used those rooms. And I said, well, that's why I'm building this house, because I want to write a book and I have to be able to explain the model in order to get people to realize that we're not living that way anymore, but we keep spending almost a third of our budget on rooms we're not using. This doesn't make sense. And at that moment, I hit the nail on the head, as it was. He allowed me to do something, just like Ross was able to change the zoning ordinances so that something that was ready to be born could be born. But it takes some persuasion and letting people in on, why am I doing this? What's the point? There is a point, but sometimes you really have to, not with fighting energy, but with wanting to enjoin in the transformational process. That's what that banker joined. Not through anger, it was through, oh, I get it. I understand what you're talking about.
What comes up for me as you're recounting this story is that it seems like our culture right now is really looking for scalable solutions. That these ideas have to be scalable and spread throughout the world, because that's the only way that we're going to overcome whatever perceived threat they're talking about. But there's glimmers here of a vastly different methodology.
That's right. Think about when things go viral. Why do they go viral? It speaks to people. If I had At the point in my career where I wanted to write The Not So Big House, started off with the premise, how am I going to make everybody build smaller houses? I would not have written that book, and I would have been taking something that was impossible to solve, and I'd probably have gotten overwhelmed from trying to solve it. Solutions to problems come from working where you are in your environment and responding to what comes your way. It isn't grandiose. It's very small. If you look at what Ross has done and what I've done, they were little tiny things in little tiny places where people heard what was going on and said, oh my goodness, that's what we need. And that's what makes something shift. It's like when you put a precipitate into a liquid and suddenly you've got a new material. It's that kind of change. And we don't believe it's possible, but it's the only way that change really happens.
I think, Sarah, as I'm seeing this, it's like if we approach something from the level of idea and concept and image, and I'm kind of shaping around my head, okay? That's one thing. If we come from knowing ourselves, in touch with our lives, in touch with our needs, in touch with those around us, and saying not only what feels good, what's needed, how can I help?
Needed.
That's coming from an authentic place.
Right.
And whether it changes the world in a big way or a small way, you've done what you can do.
And you don't know, you can't be invested in everybody getting it, because automatically you're then trying to solve something that isn't right in front of you. As you solve the problems that are right in front of you, that is where the sustainable solution resides. It's not your job to be able to make everybody do it. It'll happen if it's time. But you are simply there experiencing what you're experiencing and responding to your particular needs and interests and what you see as concerns within the community that you're serving. And that changes everything, because then it's not overwhelming. Then I always say, if you look at the letters of the word earth and the letters of the word heart, they're the same letters. Our hearts know what we need. You just have to pay attention. That's what they're
and at the heart of earth is art.
That's right. Yes, that's right. I like that. I hadn't thought of that one. That's right. And we are the artists. We're being played, and we pay attention to what we're pulled to. Massive changes happen, but we're not trying to make massive change happen. We're responding to little issues.
So along with this, Sarah and Neil, stories, sharing an authentic story is really key and critical. We can do good work, but don't just keep it to yourself. Share your story. What you've done, Sarah, is to share your story.
Yeah.
Neil, your podcasts and the work that you are doing out in the world, you're a storyteller. And I think that is a powerful way to not only do your work, but to move that out and see where that lands farther out into the world.
That's right. And probably all of us who are sitting here on this screen today, we'll hear from people who heard this recording 20 years from now, telling us what happened in their lives when they heard it. That's how it works.
Yeah.
There's a part of me that goes back to the story of how we got here. And it was listening to Ross talk about how he designs. Yeah. And the language that you would use, Ross, is that you drop into your body. And I realized living in Portland that everything that came out from me into the world came from my head. And that there was no lessons that I had ever learned in my adult life, how to drop in, tune in, deep, listen from within inside and listen to your immediate area. And that sparked the journey of why would you pick up and move and go find mentorship to learn how to do things differently? It's that right there. And I think this is another kind of pattern that it seems like both of you have have picked up on how you incorporate this work into your own lives.
Yeah.
And so I guess to wrap up this incredible conversation, and I wish that we could be doing this in the backyard, in person, and just enjoy our company in real life, because I think, this has been extraordinary beyond what I could have imagined having both of you on the call today. But you both have been really figureheads in philosophies that have gained traction. But if you're looking forward and you're saying, what is the influence that I want to have from 2022 onwards? What is your biggest, I guess, aspiration there, based on the work that you have put out into the world?
Well, so the part of what we've spoken about today that is really core in my life these days the roots are in the Not So Big Life, which is about really how do we remodel our inner worlds so that we can really fully inhabit what's here, fully appreciate what's here. And although most people think they have some clue what that means, I guarantee most people do not. Ross used a word a few minutes ago, authentic, which gets thrown around a lot these days. But learning how to actually show up in every moment of your life and experience what's actually happening, it's not what we think. It's not any projection or story. It's about actually being here, and not with preconception. And life is happening right there. That's what I'm working to help people understand. It sounds so obvious, and people will say, oh my God, not another one of these. It's not that. It's something about where the magic, the alchemical brilliance of life is happening every moment. And part of what's allowed Ross and me to do what we're doing is we get that. We've been there. And in that, it's like a flame, and you know it. So what I am very interested in doing is helping sort of spread that understanding of how to find that in yourself. So just like how to find home in a house, it's how to find home in you.
I'm going to tag on, see if I can give my little, as succinct, beautiful piece here to kind of bring some of these pieces. Neil, you've been talking about shifting from head and idea. I think that if we are enthralled with concepts and ideas and novelty, and we think, therefore we are. And I think it's a slight shift from that world into being, into presencing. How do I come in, and how am I in touch with something at the heart of the essence, the spark, the life of who I am, that is not separate from anything else? And from that place, it feels like my awareness is not a mental focus of looking at all the connections and understanding. It's a field experience. And I've described it as the beauty mind. Mm-hmm. When I'm in a state of beauty mind, and this is not a big deal, it's not a big grand deal, it's a slight shift. From a place of beauty mind, my antenna is up to where something, it might be I'm engaging a place, it might be I'm engaging in a conversation, it might be I'm out in the world, and I can feel whether something has more life or less life. And when I'm designing, I go through a process by which I hold questions. Does this bring more life? Does it give more space? Does it allow more? Does it come alive more or less? And in creating places that come alive in my own life and helping others, I try to help people come into their beauty mind sensibility themselves. And I think, Sarah, your work with a Not So Big Life, I think in many ways is helping people in the same different way, but in the same way, come into what is it that's real? What matters to me? And when I'm experiencing the world in a field way, I can go, does this feel like it moves me closer to that which matters? Or am I being numbed or shielded or shaded or, God forbid, move it away? And I think that that's the piece. And I think the shift between the not so big house, the not so big life, the not so big community, between the world that is the conventional, extractive, transactional world and the world that is regenerative is a slight shift. And it starts right here and now with the life that you're in, the moment that you're in, the relationships that you are unfolding and giving yourself to and receive from. And the ground of all that is serving love.
That's right.
What a phenomenal way to end a Friday afternoon. But it was a real treat. And Ross, you're gunning for a permanent co-host seat. I do know where you live, so we can do this in person too.
That's right.
But this was truly a great opportunity to connect with you, Sarah. And I'm so glad that you had this opportunity to come on.
I never know when I get on an interview, are we going to be talking about HVAC systems or the meaning of life? No, I love it. It's marvelous to just, like what we were just saying, you show up and what sprouts? Well, this is a pretty good sprout.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
I would love to be able to tell people about a couple of resources. I've got Susanka.com these days that gives people access to all of the different things that I'm involved in. There's one TED talk that I did, it's TEDx talk, that I love to send people to because it ties both the house and life material together. And it's called Life's Invisible Feast. But it's on fantastic. All of my websites and all the videos, you'll see them. But that one is a particularly good one for this talk, I think.
We will get all of that spread across to our community, our digital community across the internet.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Neil. And so good to see you, Ross.
Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
And thanks, Neil.
You too.
Yes,
thank you, Ross.
Bye-bye.
Care.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the show today. If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neil Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows? Maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.